thundering wall of water stretching 300 miles.
There would have been a huge flood surge, a huge wall of water. It would have been amazing.
An entire continent ripped in two.
You're talking about astronomical amounts of energy.
Could a prehistoric megaflood have torn Britain from the rest of Europe and changed world history?
We're fairly confident that this was the event that did isolate Britain from Europe.
It completely changed us. It changed the course of Britain.
And could a flood like this happen again? 450,000 years ago, a massive earthquake fractures a peninsula in northwestern Europe. The violent tremor demolishes a land bridge connecting England and France and unleashes a lake the size of Texas on a collision course with the Atlantic Ocean. Suddenly, a thundering wall of water 10 miles wide sweeps across the land, obliterating everything in its path.
The front of this thing would have ice and big blocks of rock moving the same as fast-moving vehicles on a highway.
For more than a month, the violent tide swallows up enormous areas of Earth. When the torrent finally subsides, the European continent has been broken in two. The massive peninsula to the north is now an island, separated from Europe by a vast channel.
When you're talking about a gigantic torrent of water like this, it's not just covering the land, it's carving the land in its path. And what we're seeing here is that it literally dug an English Channel for itself.
It would have been a huge and spectacular event. I mean, one of the biggest, movements of water that we know about in geological history.
Could a massive flood really have carved the English Channel in a geological instant and forever severed Great Britain from the rest of Europe? Today, the English Channel is one of the world's most famous and well-traveled waterways, stretching 350 miles between the North Sea and the Atlantic. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Dover, the channel is only 21 miles across. On a clear day, you can see all the way to France. This small body of water has shaped the British character and been witness to some of the most seminal events in history. The Romans launched an invasion of Britain through the Channel in 43 AD. William the Conqueror crossed the Channel to become King of England in 1066. And the Allied forces in World War II used the Channel to launch the surprise invasion of Normandy on D-Day. But is it possible that this waterway didn't always exist? That at some point in the remote past, it would have been possible to walk from Paris to London? A close inspection of the cliffs on each side of the channel, at Dover in England and Calais in France, reveals surprising similarities that suggest the two countries may have once been connected.
These are the famous White Cliffs of Dover. They're, for many people, the iconic image of Britain as an island. What we can see is at Dover is that we see this ridge that's made out of pure chalk. And what's amazing is that when you go across to France, to the other side of the Dover Strait, we see exactly the same chalk rock layers exposed in cliff faces, but in France. And so it's very clear to actually connect these two up.
The carved cliffs of Dover and Calais seem to be missing a 300-foot high, 20-mile-wide chunk in the middle. Could this be the missing land bridge that once linked Great Britain to the continent of Europe? There's another clue that suggests Britain may have once been connected to Europe. Evidence of its earliest inhabitants.
The first people we have evidence of from stone tools were here at least 700,000 years ago. This is a hand axe that was made about 500,000 years ago.
If there were early humans in Britain 700,000 years ago, how did they get across the English Channel? Man would not develop boats for hundreds of thousands of years.
Because it's not a very wide body of water. I mean, just over 20 miles at its narrowest point. But even so, if you haven't got boats, that's not going to be easy to cross. So what we think happened, the Neanderthals did not have boats. When the first people came into Britain, there was a permanent land bridge. We were joined on to Europe. They were able to walk across this land bridge. So if you can imagine where, say, the chalk cliffs of Dover are today, in the past they ran continuously as a land bridge right across to France.
But if England were once joined to France, what could have caused the land between them to vanish without a trace? For years, geologists suggested erosion as the prime suspect. Slow erosion can produce dramatic effects over millions of years. To understand just how strong a force this process is, we can look at one of the most famous examples of erosion, the Grand Canyon. The ravines carved there by the Colorado River stretch for 277 miles and run more than a mile deep. And they took 17 million years to carve. Now imagine a canyon like this being carved in a matter of weeks by a catastrophic flood. That's the radical hypothesis scientists Sanjeev Gupta and Jenny Collier at Imperial College London are suggesting happened to the English Channel.
The power of the flood would have created a huge gash in this ridge that carved these cliffs that we see today. People had actually thought that this rock ridge had basically been worn away slowly by natural erosion process. For example, waves lapping up at the edges of this rock ridge and progressively cutting that ridge back, much as you see on the present-day coastline. But those are very, very slow processes, and they take hundreds of thousands, millions of years. What we're arguing is that the process that carved this ridge and carved these valleys happened in a matter of weeks or months.
But is water powerful enough to break off a piece of a continent in a matter of weeks? Not everyone in the scientific community was convinced.
This land barrier, which was made of bedrock chalk, it's difficult to see how that would collapse in a very short time, which would be necessary to provide a massive flood event.
But Gupta and Collier believed that a massive flood was responsible for creating the English Channel in a geological instant.
We're fairly confident that this was the event that did isolate Britain from Europe.
So we've never actually witnessed one of these events, but you know, even looking at the scale of what happens in modern floods, it would have been a truly terrifying experience, I think. I don't think I'd like to have been there.
The scientists argued the flood capable of unleashing such destruction would have been on a magnitude we have never seen. The closest we may have come occurred right here in the heart of America. In 1993, record rains hammered the Midwest and caused the Mississippi and Missouri rivers and all their tributaries to overflow their banks.
It rained and flooded for something like 200 days, which is hard for most people to imagine. It's sort of relentless. And the Mississippi River overflowed its banks, flooded out entire towns, took away railway lines, gas lines, telephone lines, wiped out farms and cattle.
The destruction was massive and widespread, covering 9 states and 400,000 square miles. The flood lasted for weeks. Its devastating effects took years to undo.
It went on and on. and caused millions of dollars worth of damage, and it took years for them to recover.
But as deadly as this flood was, eventually the waters receded and the landscape returned to the same condition. The face of the earth was unchanged. The flood that created the English Channel was on a totally different scale. It was a flood that would reshape the globe. It was a mega flood.
There's a different kind of flood, a high-energy flood, where the water develops extremely high velocities. And these are phenomenally destructive. They're the floods that can move huge boulders and create massive destruction, much larger than the kinds of flows of water that people usually think of. The quantity of water could easily fill the Grand Canyon.
Victor Baker at the University of Arizona has been studying megafloods for more than 20 years.
The term megaflood really does have a meaning in that mega stands for million. They've generally been on the order of at least 1 million cubic meters per second. That order or larger.
1 million cubic meters of water. That's 300 times the amount that flows over Niagara Falls in a second.
Quantity of water moving in a megaflood is much greater than what's driving those little turbines in, let's say, Hoover Dam or even Three Gorges Dam. You're talking about astronomical amounts of energy.
In modern times, floods occur because of heavy rains or when rivers overrun their banks. But the formation of a megaflood requires a perfect storm of environmental circumstances. A massive amount of water trapped by a natural land barrier, and a seismic shock such as an earthquake, which can unleash the violent power of the water in an instant. Could this have been the scenario that tore England from the rest of Europe? Could an earthquake have ripped open the barrier that held back an enormous lake, sending enough water to fill Texas, racing across Europe? What evidence could there be to support this theory?
One of the difficulties we have with all megafloods is exactly how was it initiated. Just like a detective, the geologist has to try to figure this out from the available evidence. And when flood removes the evidence, that leaves very little to go on.
Just how will scientists piece this prehistoric puzzle together? $450,000 years ago, a powerful earthquake in northern Europe rocks the continent, unleashing the waters of an enormous lake on a devastating path of destruction. A massive megaflood tears across the land like a million speeding trains, ripping up the earth in its wake.
There would have been a huge flood surge, a huge wall of water coming through this ridge, just terrifying.
When the massive flood finally ends, the continent of Europe has been cut in two.
It would have been amazing. The scale of it, Niagara Falls would look like a Sunday picnic compared to it. It would have been surging past, a really frightening place to be near.
But is this catastrophic megaflood real or just legend? A pair of experts at Imperial College London, Sanjeev Gupta, a geologist, and Jenny Collier, a marine geophysicist, believe it really happened.
Well, this flood event basically explains why Britain's an island.
For years, popular belief held that if Britain had been connected to Europe, millions of years of erosion and rising sea levels could have eventually cut it off and created the English Channel. But a radical theory that the island of Britain could have been broken off from the continent of Europe by a massive flood was first proposed in 1985 by Alex Smith, a marine geologist. But Smith had little evidence to back up his claim. monitor scientists Gupta and Collier. In 2007, Gupta and Collier made an astounding discovery that suggested Smith's theory might be correct. They were testing state-of-the-art sonar equipment in the English Channel that revealed the seabed in spectacular detail.
The sonar equipment basically traces a line up and down the seafloor and measures the depth of water. And this allows us to really in detail map the seafloor topography.
A remarkable picture of the seafloor came into view. In a part of the world not known for abrupt geological contours, they saw a large valley stretching 10 miles wide, hundreds of miles in length, and more than 300 feet deep.
And it was just stunning. It was just extraordinary. What we could see was a huge valley carved into rock, but just quite extraordinarily enormous compared to normal river valleys.
If you're British, everything, landscape, it's not like being in the Himalayas. Everything's kind of smooth. We've got little rivers. The South Downs are all very soft and gentle. And then sitting right in the middle of the English Channel, you've got this enormous carved feature. It had to be something really significant.
This underwater valley didn't look like the English River Valley's topside, which had been dug out by gradual erosion over time.
One very distinctive thing about this landscape, and particularly this valley, is that it's extremely wide, and it has beautiful smooth sides. Now, when rivers normally cut valleys, they have ragged edges, they're sinuous, they're curving, but this has sheer linear sides. They're straight, and we believe that something like this can only be carved by very powerful flows cutting straight through the bedrock.
As their discovery sunk in, Collier and Gupta remembered Alex Smith's megaflood theory and realized they might have just proven it.
My mind immediately leapt back to the original Smith paper and realized here was the mechanism. For the first time, we had really conclusive evidence to say that a megaflood had carved this extensive valley system in the English Channel.
Could a megaflood really have separated Britain from Europe and created a valley that became the English Channel? In order to create a megaflood, there would have to be a massive amount of water. The question was, where did this water come from? 450,000 years ago, the time the scientists believed the flood happened, the world was in the middle of an ice age. The continents were gripped by glaciers.
If you could have flown over Britain 450,000 years ago, it would have been unrecognisable from the Britain we see today. So you would have seen a huge covering of an ice sheet, in places perhaps a mile thick. So perhaps the little tops of mountains poking out of this ice sheet, and south of that ice sheet, a polar desert, a treeless landscape similar to the northern Arctic of today.
The ice had advanced from Norway. We know that because we can find Norwegian rocks in northern Britain.
In this Ice Age setting, an enormous freshwater lake likely formed at the northern edge of modern Britain and stretched for hundreds of miles, blocked to the north by the massive glaciers.
Well, the lake would be probably something equivalent to the Great Lakes in North America. So if you want to relate it to, for example, Lake Huron or Lake Erie, it probably took 2,000 or 3,000 years to fill.
As the Ice Age draws to a close and the Earth's temperature rises, the glaciers across Europe start to recede. Meltwater flows into the already massive lake that is trapped between the glaciers to the north and the ridge of chalk to the south, which acts as a natural dam or levee holding water back. Pressure builds on all sides, and something has to give.
The water had nowhere to go. The ice to the north would have blocked any exit through the north of the North Sea, and this ridge of chalk would have held it back to the east.
ridge of chalk at the southern edge of the lake is the weak link and breaks under the pressure.
The weak point was not the ice, because it was real thick in the north. The weak point is the soft chalk between what's now Dover, England, and Calais in France.
The water in the lake pressing against the rock ridge would have actually broken through, would have started peeling away, eroding through the rock ridge, and eventually the force of the water would have been so great it would have gouged a canyon through this ridge.
But could the pressure of glacial meltwater really have single-handedly brought about a mega flood of this magnitude? Collier and Gupta speculate that Mother Nature provided a little extra push. They believe it was likely that an earthquake helped fracture the ridge of chalk holding back the lake, opening the door for billions of gallons of water to pour out.
We know that there are small earthquakes, for example, off the south coast from time to time, and possibly this event only happened because of a coincidence between a small earthquake and a high water level behind the dam, and that's what caused it to fail.
Could a flood triggered by an earthquake have cut Europe in two and changed world history? Could this explain the canyon at the bottom of the English Channel? What other evidence would show that these striking underwater formations are really the result of a catastrophic flood and not a more gradual geologic process? Have there been other megafloods across this planet and beyond? 450,000 years ago, a cataclysmic megaflood surges across northern Europe, cutting a furious path. A wall of water 100 feet high carves a vast canyon through the earth, forever cutting the continent of Europe in two. Is this how Great Britain became an island? Professors Sanjeev Gupta and Jenny Collier at Imperial College London think so, and they believe they have the evidence to prove it. They had discovered a curious landscape at the bottom of the English Channel. Steep canyons, sharp sides, and other unusual features that they think only a megaflood could have carved.
One very distinctive thing about this landscape is that it's extremely wide, and it has beautiful smooth sides.
The features on the floor of the English Channel are big channel features. Therefore, there was at some point a big flow. In the megaflood, that water wants to go straight. It wants to get away fast, and it isn't interested in bends. In fact, if it encounters a valley that previously had bends, it tears the bends out completely.
But could a flood have created the English Channel? Is it possible for a mass of water to cut a valley stretching hundreds of miles in length and more than 10 miles across in a matter of weeks? Geologists didn't think so. Traditional science had always suggested that massive changes to the landscape generally take place over long periods of time. Processes like the creation of mountains and erosion take millions of years. But is there a landscape that defies conventional wisdom and may be a key to understanding the origin of the English Channel? The channeled scabland in America's eastern Washington state is a vast network of channels, valleys, and bizarre geological features that extend for hundreds of miles.
Channeled scabland has a whole series of features. They include rock basins. The rock basins can be 100 meters deep and kilometers long. There are giant grooves that are carved into the rock, and hills that have the shape of the bottom of a canoe if you turned it upside down.
For years, geologists believed this landscape had to be carved by slow water erosion over millions of years. but no natural rivers ran through the scablands. Others believed glaciers had cut the enormous cliffs and valleys in the last ice age, but it's unlikely those glaciers ever reached this area. Then a geologist in the 1920s put forward a fantastic theory. A giant flood had carved the channeled scabland. At the time, the idea was met with contempt. No one could imagine how water could have reshaped the land so dramatically.
In the 19th century, geologists espoused that small forces, small flows of water acting over long periods of time were somehow a better explanation for the kinds of features that were seen in landscapes.
Scientists wondered, even if a megaflood were possible, where would the water have come from? When evidence of a massive ancient glacial lake was found in nearby Montana, the geological community finally accepted the shocking truth that the scablands were formed when the lake burst through its natural dam. An estimated 520 cubic miles of water spilled out all across Washington state, from Montana to the Pacific Ocean, carving this extraordinary landscape.
The flooding was probably about 10, 15 miles wide here. You can see from one horizon to the other. And the water that was flowing around the island on which I'm standing is probably on the order of 200 feet deep.
All the evidence found in the channeled scabland, the sheer cliffs, steep canyons, streamlined islands, and gouges, is now accepted as proof that a cataclysmic megaflood tore through there 15,000 years ago.
Rock is very resistant to erosion, and water is relatively soft when it's not moving very fast. People have generally thought, well, you know, how can water erode rock? But when the water velocities get very high, you can get processes that are quite capable of cutting into rock. And this idea gradually took hold that this was made by catastrophic floods.
These unique geological features seen at the scablands can also be found at the bottom of the English Channel. This was the clear connection that Professor Gupta and his colleague were looking for.
And I thought, gosh, this looks exactly like what we see in the English Channel. We could see exactly the same features at similar scales in the English Channel, in the channeled scabland. What we see on long linear gouges, many miles long, and they're thought to have been carved by huge vortices in the flows, almost like miniature tornadoes.
Flooding behaves like a vacuum cleaner. It picks up blocks of rock and then carries them away.
The channeled scabland is not the only other landscape that may have been created by megafloods. There is even evidence of this same process happening far, far away on the planet Mars.
So the other place we can see characteristic features of megafloods is actually on the planet Mars. What you can make out are these huge valleys that have been carved into the Martian surface. These valleys are thousands of miles long and tens of miles wide and many hundreds of feet deep.
There definitely has been mega flooding on Mars. The valleys that we think were carved or at least modified by water on Mars, they come in a whole variety of ranges, from things that are the size of the Grand Canyon to things that are the size of, say, the Great Rift of Africa or the Red Sea, something of that scale.
These Martian megafloods may make the English Channel seem like a babbling brook. But they clearly show megafloods are not isolated events. They can happen anywhere, especially here on Earth. Perhaps even creating the English Channel.
And what you're seeing here is the very same streamlined islands we see in the channeled scabland and in the English Channel.
We see areas where rocks and such have been carried out onto the plains, where the canyons disgorge out onto the plains. And all that means a lot of water moved in a short time.
If a massive megaflood did destroy the land bridge linking Britain to Europe, what happened to early humans and animals living in the region? Could this flood have changed the course of history and the course of evolution? 250,000 years ago, did a mega flood tear through Europe, forever splitting England from the rest of the continent? Could the vast English Channel be the remnant of this ancient flood and be proof of a prehistoric storm that reshaped the face of the globe?
I was actually quite opposed to the idea originally. What convinced me was the morphology on the floor of the channel, which closely resembles the morphology that we associate with substantial floods.
But if an ancient flood did cut off Great Britain from Europe, it would have been more than just an epic natural disaster. How might this flood have affected early humans? Could this storm have impacted evolution? And might this one event have changed the course of history?
One of the most significant things about this mega flood is that it really changed the geography, what we call the paleogeography, what happened to the geography of the past. It completely changed this. It changed the course of Britain.
Perhaps if these events hadn't have happened, then we would still have a land bridge between us and France, and Britain wouldn't have formed, and obviously that would have had a, very profound effect.
At the time of the flood, early humans had been inhabiting areas in Great Britain for hundreds of thousands of years, beginning as far back as 700,000 years ago.
The first people we have evidence of from stone tools were here at least 700,000 years ago. They were able to walk across this land bridge.
After the mega flood, the water in the channel meant that access to Britain would have been cut off for long periods at a time. Only during times of incredibly low global sea levels could early humans have been able to walk to Britain from the continent of Europe, causing them to be cut off from other human populations.
At times, people may actually have been, in a sense, trapped here. The channel formed and they couldn't get back across. So for a period of time, people may have been isolated here.
A small group of early humans could have been stranded on Britain for hundreds of thousands of years with no contact with other early humans in Europe. Is it possible that these isolated people would have developed into a unique species of man? It might not be as far-fetched as it sounds. Evolutionary biologists believe that isolated populations can evolve into new and distinct subspecies. Isolated island populations have been responsible for producing some of the world's most unusual animals, such as the giant tortoises and iguanas of the Galapagos Islands.
Elephants have become pygmy-sized on some oceanic islands. There are also different species that have become giants. Komodo dragons are examples of these giant lizards that have evolved on an island.
Could this same process of unique evolution have been occurring in Britain? The fossil record seems to suggest that the process was at least happening in animals.
And what we find in Britain is an increasingly strange, if you like, mixture of animals turning up in Britain compared with those that live in Europe. Wolves appear to have evolved. They seem to develop bigger and stronger teeth. Presumably they're scavenging. And we find that the bears, the brown bear that's there, grows to a huge size, probably even bigger than a polar bear, and seems to take on the role of an active hunter. So there is this sort of evolutionary change going on, that animals are adapting to this British niche.
But the evolution of these distinct animals would be halted by a series of ice ages that plunged temperatures and disrupted the food chain. These same frigid temperatures were also responsible for killing off the early human population in Britain.
So as we look through the British record, we have rich evidence at 500,000 years, at 400,000 years. And then as we move on to 300,000 and 200,000, we actually seem to find less evidence of people in Britain. When we get to 120,000 years ago, we're not a single trace of humans being there at that time.
But while early humans in Britain seem to have perished, their relatives in Europe did not. What led one population to flourish while another faded? The answer may be as simple as numbers.
Certainly, a population in small numbers is threatened and may not be viable, and that too may have happened to the human populations, that if they were isolated here, their numbers were just not sufficient to maintain themselves as a population, and they just died out.
If early humans had survived in Britain, would they have been genetically different?
If populations of humans were on those islands and isolated from other populations, could well be that they evolve new characteristics and could maybe even evolve into different species.
Early humans would disappear from Britain for more than 100,000 years.
The incredible thing is, it's only in the last 12,000 years that we've got a continuity of human populations right through to the present day.
The mega flood that broke apart Europe 450,000 years ago was one of the most astonishing and powerful forces in geological history, forever severing Great Britain from the continent of Europe. But as powerful as this flood was, it couldn't triumph over human ingenuity. In 1994, mankind would finally reconnect Britain to Europe with the completion of the Channel, a 30-mile undersea rail tunnel connecting England and France beneath the Strait of Dover. Though reconnected through the Channel, the British remain steadfastly independent, and the English Channel plays a large part in giving them a distinct identity.
British still feel that they should have some kind of slight separation, some kind of slight difference between us and the continent, even though it's only 30 miles across.
In many ways, Britain and the British don't really feel part of Europe. There is a British identity, and I think this event created that. I think if this event hadn't happened, there would have been nothing distinctive about this promontory that sticks out into the North Atlantic.
The catastrophic power of the Ice Age megaflood permanently changed world geography. But just imagine the havoc that another megaflood would wreak on our modern world. In some places on our planet, that threat is all too real. Years ago, a glacial lake larger than Texas broke through its natural dam and tore through hundreds of miles of prehistoric Europe, isolating Britain. Could another megaflood rip through a region of the world today? It's not likely that a glacial lake will burst and threaten a major city anytime soon, but there is a potential modern-day counterpart: levees and the man-made hydroelectric mega dam.
There's something like 80,000 major dams here in this country, holding back billions of gallons of water. The potential for disasters everywhere.
But can these dams and levees be broken by the force of this water? What if one of these massive dams catastrophically failed? It's happened before.
One minute you have a dam that's holding back millions of gallons of water. Suddenly the dam is falling apart and that water is coming out, sweeping away everything in its path.
With a dam break, it's so abrupt, it's so sudden, and the water is moving so quickly that it really has the power to catch people unaware.
In 1928, the newly built St. Francis Dam in California, just 35 miles north of Los Angeles, failed 3 minutes before midnight on March 12th. Considered the worst American civil engineering disaster of the 20th century, the flood killed more than 450 people.
A wall of water came crashing down a valley and wiped out towns when people were asleep. There was no forewarning.
It had a wave that was in excess of 100 feet tall. And this wave was so powerful, it actually was carrying 10,000-ton concrete blocks that were pieces of the burst dam as far as a mile downstream. And that's really the power that these waves have to carry and to move and to bulldoze the land that they strike.
Levee breaks are no less destructive. Witness the devastation visited on New Orleans after the levees failed in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. What would happen if a massive dam and a network of levees failed in the same place? Could it create a flood like the one at the English Channel 450,000 years ago? It's an unlikely scenario, but in Sacramento, California, the possibility does exist.
It's been named the most flood-prone city in the country, even more vulnerable than New Orleans.
Downtown Sacramento sits at the confluence of two major rivers, the Sacramento and the American.
Much like New Orleans and the Mississippi River Valley, Sacramento exists in a shallow, wide bowl. It's also situated next to two rivers, so you have a potential for a perfect storm of flooding there.
To protect the city from these rivers, a series of levees was built around the city, beginning more than 150 years ago. Today, many of them need constant maintenance.
A lot of them, I can tell you from personal experience, are full of potholes, gopher holes, rotting vegetation, moving rocks. If we don't maintain those levees, they're going to collapse.
Looming over these levees, 25 miles northeast of Sacramento, is the massive Folsom Dam, holding back a lake covering 10,000 acres. But experts have discovered a flaw in the 9-mile dam. If the dam fills too rapidly, they can't quickly lower the water level without potentially overwhelming the levee system downstream, a possibly lethal scenario in the event of a powerful storm. Should a major storm hit, the warm rains could melt the snowpack of the Sierra Nevada mountains just 75 miles east of the city. The water would come rushing down the American and Sacramento rivers. Experts fear that Folsom Dam may not be able to hold the high volume of water created by some storms.
You can imagine a huge wall of water, 30, 50 feet high, pushing its way straight down that river right into the city.
The water would drive down the American River and smash straight into the levees, sending millions of gallons of water into downtown Sacramento. The state capitol would be submerged under several feet of water, shutting down the government and possibly the entire economy.
You're talking about gigantic amounts of water arriving in a very short time.
If the levees on the Sacramento River also fail, nearly 500,000 people would be at risk from a sudden flood.
You could potentially have a cascading effect where one levee gives way, a surge of water comes through, another levee gives way, and the dominoes lead you right into Sacramento and the surrounding farmlands.
In 2006, California officials began a project to double the flood protection of Sacramento by 2014, upgrading the levee system and building a new spillway for the Folsom Dam. But the clock is ticking, and Mother Nature may decide to strike before the project is complete. It is impossible to predict if fate will unleash another mega flood like the one that created the English Channel. But man's attempt to control water has created many scenarios that could lead to potential disaster.
Mankind has come a long way with technology, with trying to mold the earth to our needs, but there are some things that still leave us powerless. A rush of water barreling down a hill or breaking through a dam or overflowing the banks of a river is a really good reminder that nature is still a lot more powerful than we are.